Good morning. My name is Joanna Marquez Diaz, and I am a CHCI Public Policy Fellow presented by PepsiCo Foundation. I'm delighted to be here with you today for our Moment in History promoting equitable representation in clinical research session. As an early career scientist, I'm excited to learn from exceptional professionals devoted to diversifying scientific and medical research. Their experiences and insight will not only enrich my own knowledge, but also inspire me to actively contribute to the ongoing efforts to create a more equitable and inclusive research landscape. On behalf of CHCI, I would like to thank Amgen, Bristol Myers Squibb, Ferring's Pharmaceutical, Genentech, for their generous support of this session. It is now my pleasure to introduce welcoming remarks from Tiffany Shackelford. Tiffany Shackelford is Senior Manager of Government Relations and Public Policy and Head of Health Equity and Advocacy. In her role, Tiffany develops, leads, executes Ferring's strategic approach to government advocacy, engagement with payer, provider, medical, patient, and non-governmental organizations, and industry organizations, interacting with policies impacting patient health and product launches. Please welcome Tiffany Shackelford.
Hi, thank you. Good morning. I forgot I do all that until she just read it out loud, so thank you so much. I'm Tiffany Shackelford here on behalf of Ferring Pharmaceuticals, and just want to say that it is our absolute pleasure to be one of the sponsors of today's panel to discuss the importance of promoting equitable representation in clinical trials. We understand that diverse clinical research and trials lead to equitable outcomes, solutions with respect to healthcare treatment. However, underrepresentation continues to be an issue, especially amongst our Latino population and other ethnic minorities. Many factors, including socioeconomic barriers, healthcare deserts, language access, and more, remain a challenge in connecting diverse patient populations with clinical trials. This may lead to trials that are not fully representative of the patients who actually need and will ultimately use a particular product. Lack of clinical trial diversity may also limit effectiveness of treatment in such a way that could lead to poor health and even death. We at Ferring are pleased to be a part of this conversation amongst healthcare professionals, medical experts, and community advocates seeking to rectify this issue. We understand that the exclusion of diverse representation in clinical trials may also impact treatment's safety and efficacy. We hope that this conversation will lead to innovative ideas and legislative proposals to close critical healthcare gaps in healthcare and clinical trials. Thank you to the Congressional Hispanic Caucus Institute and Chairman Espaillat and all of our panelists here today for your leadership on this issue, and we look forward to a riveting discussion. Thank you.
Thank you, Tiffany Shackelford. It is now my pleasure to introduce today's moderator, Gustavo Paredes. Gustavo Paredes is an experienced senior professional with more than 30 years of experience in strategic planning, organizational development, government relations, coalition building, and communications. He has worked in areas of government, housing, public broadcasting, arts, and community development. Mr. Paredes is also a member of the Rare Disease Coalition, Diversity Coalition. Please welcome Gustavo Paredes.
Well, thank you so much, Joanna and Tiffany, for those remarks, and thank you, Leonard, for adjusting my mic, because certainly I thought I would get it there and try to do a little projection. Projection. But anyway, I want to also give thanks to the Congressional Hispanic Caucus for hosting this thought-provoking conference and, focusing attention on the representation of Latino in clinical trials. As you know, we are one of the largest ethnic groups in the United States, and Latinos continue to be underrepresented in these clinical trials. We only make up about 6 or 7% of participants in the clinical trials. So in this conversation that we're going to be having, we're going to hope to illuminate the complexity of the clinical trials, and particularly for Latinos. As you all know, we're a population of racial, ethnic, and economic diversity. So what I'm going to do now is introduce my four experts on this panel. And from my left, I want you to please welcome Claudia Barajas.
Thank you.
So Claudia is currently the Community Engagement Manager at Vanderbilt Ingram Cancer Center. This role involves Claudia in strengthening the use of evidence-based strategies to increase awareness and engagement in cancer prevention, as well as clinical trial participation in order to reduce cancer risks and disparities among African Americans, rural and Latino populations within the VICC catchment area. And over there is Rachel Ricadio, is Director of Representation and Clinical Research at Amgen. In her current role at Amgen, Raquel oversees the embedding of inclusive research principles across the clinical trial cycles, drives the innovative thinking and organizational critical change to this work, and engages with the broader research and development and healthcare communities to listen, learn, and partner on ethics pursuing greater health equity. And then Dr. Pierre Theodore. He serves as the Executive Director of Patient Inclusion Equity at global pharmaceutical firm Roche Genentech. Dr. Pierre has over 2 days of experience in clinical education, healthcare, venture capital investing, and research and development, most recently at Johnson & Johnson. He has been instrumental in programmatic medical device and drug development, including minimally invasive therapies to treat and diagnose lung cancer, early infant diagnosis of HIV, population health efforts in tuberculosis treatment, and peripheral arterial disease. And finally, but not least, Lorena Curry. As head of diversity for R&D, she is responsible for driving the diversity in clinical trial enterprise strategy with the objective of recruiting a patient population that is more reflective of the real world and aligned with the epidemiology of disease studies. And so while we're here, it's also helpful if you can sort of be free to comments here, do hashtag CHCI, HHM23. So we're going to start our conversations, and we're going to probably start with Claudia. I'm going to start out with you. And could you elaborate on the specific challenges that Hispanic or Latino and other historical included communities face when participating in clinical research? And how do these challenges vary from those experienced by other ethnic groups?
Thank you, Gustavo. I'm delighted to be here today. As I mentioned, my name is Claudia Barajas, and I work at Vanderbilt Ingram Cancer Center. I'm an immigrant from Colombia. I moved to the United States 30 years ago, and I started working in the public health with helping the Hispanic community to increase access to health services 25 years ago. And 8 of those years, I've been working in Vanderbilt doing community engagement and making sure the Latino community and the African American are included. I'm going to start with the basic definition about clinical trials because that's going to be the main conversation for today. And clinical trial or clinical investigations is a type of a study that tries to find better ways to prevent, detect, and treat diseases like cancer, diabetes, heart disease, or any other diseases. I think it's very important that we all should participate, people from all ages, ethnicities, backgrounds, sick, healthy, people with special needs, and everybody should be part of the clinical trials because with everybody being part of the clinical trials, we will have treatments that will work for everybody. I think it's very important to have that definition. When we talk about the specific challenges that the Hispanic community and the African American community are several. Those challenges are different in each community, different for the Latino, different for the African American. But among those challenges, we talk about mistrust due to negative past experiences. Immigration status for the Latinos is a huge. No need to be U.S. citizens to participate in a clinical trial, and they are afraid to go to the trial because they might be reported. So we need to continue the education about you don't need to be a U.S. citizen to participate in a clinical trial. Restricted criteria to participate in those clinical trials. Sometimes I don't see myself or somebody that doesn't speak English doesn't see themselves participating in that clinical trial because the trials are specific for only English-speaking people. So in that moment, the community that speaks only Spanish is not included. The protocols sometimes are not inclusive, so we have to start working from the protocols to be able to include, since the beginning, that participation of minorities in clinical trials and how are we going to address those participations and include community members at the table when those protocols are being designed. Lack of knowledge about the importance of participating in clinical trials. I go to the community often to provide education about the importance of participating and having difficult discussions with the community that sometimes takes more than 1 hour, sometimes take 2 hours because people want to be heard, people want to be acknowledged about those negative experiences if they have it. They want to learn about the distrust that their communities have. Consent forms are difficult to understand, not at the literacy level that the people needs to read. Very legalistic, and it's not, we will talk about ethical issues later. Uninsured, fear to financial toxicity, that I'm pretty sure we're gonna address this in the future, and limited funds allocated to compensate participants. So I think it's very important to allocate those funds when we create those trials and develop those protocols. Allocate funds to incentivize people not to participate in the clinical trial or pay to participate in the clinical trial. Compensate for their time they're taking to come to the trial. And I'm gonna let my friends and the other group to continue with the conversation.
Yes, Dr. Pierre, let me ask you, what are the key reasons behind the persistent underrepresentation of Latinos in clinical trials in the United States? And how does this impact the validity of medical research findings to the community?
Starting off with a very easy question, apparently.
Well, yes.
So I think it's important to categorize the disparities in clinical trial from my standpoint in 3 domains. And the first is trust. And the second is equity and fairness, and then the third is the knowledge generation that comes through clinical trials. And each of them provide opportunities, but also barriers to care. I think at a fundamental level, and I put trust first, is that there are concerns about medical systems that have often mistreated populations and the value of that medical system in being able to deliver cutting-edge care. So it starts from a fundamental sense of distrust, and that comes from medical systems that have often abandoned their responsibility to care for all populations of patients. So understandably, there is an issue of trust. I often sort of turn on its head and say it's not that populations don't trust, it's that the medical systems themselves are not trustworthy. They haven't earned the trust of these populations. And then the second issue from my perspective is the importance of the evidence and the knowledge that is generated from these trials. We know that different populations respond to drugs and therapeutics differently. It makes no sense to assume that every person from every geographic and social and economic background and gender background will be likely to respond similarly to drugs. So it's incumbent upon us as drug manufacturers to explore the issue of differences in response, biologic differences, social differences that end up manifesting as a different response to drugs in clinical trials. That's the second most important issue around inclusion in clinical trials. And the last one is really a question of equity and fairness. I think fundamentally this comes down to an issue of human rights, an issue of inclusion. Clinical trials are an important part of the delivery of advanced clinical care. So you can't propose to a patient that you're offering all that one can for the treatment of advanced cancer, all that one can for the treatment of advanced cardiovascular disease, and not also be willing to offer clinical trials as well. So there are, if you will, 3 different opportunities and 3 different barriers that many marginalized populations, including the Latino population, face that result in this underrepresentation in clinical trials.
Lorena, what are the primary reasons that have historically prevented Latinos from participating in clinical trials?
Thank you. And that is as well a multifactorial response, right? Because there is not one single. But I think we can refer to, we do not know enough about the Latino population as we think. In total transparency, there have been so many great efforts to increase the participation of Black patients in clinical trials, addressing the issues of trust, getting closer to the communities, and we try to mirror that or do the same with Latino patients, because God, that wouldn't work. I was in awe yesterday when I heard that we're not a monolith over and over, that we're not a niche. Guys, I consider myself a Latino since 10 years ago, right? But interestingly, my immigration status, my race, all of those have a different intersectionality. We need to get to know those communities before, during, and after inviting them to participate in a clinical trial. The other very important part, back to the trust, there is a better concordance factor between a Hispanic principal investigator, a Hispanic healthcare provider, enrolling or treating more Hispanic patients. Just, can you imagine how many Hispanic oncologists we have in the US? Like less than 4%. So we do have a matter of an entire ecosystem that we need to address. Adding to that, you also mentioned something about the eligibility criteria and how the trials are not always designed thinking of this community in mind. Again, this is multifactorial, but what makes me happy is that we are today here and that we're trying to make it better for our community. So I don't know, I don't want to take more time, so maybe we'll give it the next question to Raquel, so I'll hand it back to you.
Well, Raquel, since, what are the long-term benefits and potential impacts on public health outcomes if we successfully address the underrepresentation of Latinos and other minority groups in clinical trials?
So I swear I did not know you were going to ask me this particular question, but I'm glad that you did, because before my career in clinical research, I actually was in public health. And most of my background has been in public health research, studying disparities to healthcare access as well as health outcomes. So you'll see that our strategy at Amgen and also my colleagues' strategies is really based in a public health mindset. It's based in community-based participatory research because the vast majority of clinical trials are actually run by industry sponsors, particularly in the US. So because of that, and because clinical trials develop medicines and therapies for patients across the country, we really see clinical trial diversity as a piece of contribution to public health in general. Most people don't think about industry sponsors and pharmaceutical companies as being part of the public health sphere, but it really is. Like, they're doing so much of the research across the country and with patients, across the board. So that's why when we see clinical trials being more diverse, being more representative, it really is affecting public health on a massive scale, because what we're doing is affecting it on the scale from a clinical trial perspective and reaching more of the patients than we do across the country.
No, thank you. Claudia, can you share insights into the ethical considerations surrounding efforts to increase Latino participation in clinical trials? Particularly in terms of, as you indicated earlier, informed consent, patient autonomy, and data privacy.
Thank you, that's a very good question. There is 4 main ethical principles defined and explained in the consent form. And one is beneficence, the obligation of physician to act to the benefit of the patient. Non-maleficent is the obligation of the physician not to harm the patient. Autonomy is that all persons should be empowered to take their own decisions, and justice is generally interpreted as a fair, equitable, and appropriate treatment of persons. When we talk about autonomy, and a participant comes to a clinical trial and they do not speak English, and they have a consent form that is written in legalistic English, and they have to sign that to be able to participate in the clinical trial without understand anything, is an ethical issue. And we have to address that because we are not giving the autonomy to that person to understand what they are saying. So I think it's very important to work in creating consent forms in the language of the person that wants to participate in the clinical trial, and make sure they follow and understand all the steps.
Well,
Clay, can I build on that, because I think it's such an important point, that the linguistic competence is sort of a component of a larger issue of cultural competence. And you can have a translator sitting right next to you, translating word for word, but that doesn't actually mean that you're connecting at a kind of a cultural level. And I think part of it is understanding. It's as I think you mentioned, the types of investigators, the types of clinical trial coordinators. The connection has to be beyond just this idea of translation, which is often how principal investigators think. If I just manage to meet at a sort of a linguistic, cognitive level, that will be okay, and that misses out on a lot of the sort of cultural demands that are placed on the patients and which we have to overcome in order to improve engagement in clinical trials.
I think the other piece of this too is, right, as we talk about, being immigrants, I'm a first-generation American with immigrant parents myself, a lot of the informed consent process is also involving the family, right, the children, parents, other community members. They are part of the informed consent and decision process. So that's another piece as we think about Hispanic with Latino communities is the informed consent is not just for the patient, right, it's for their family and their communities making that decision together.
Yeah. And adding to that, health literacy and linguistics is just one portion, right? Because our community also is not very familiar with lots of civic literacy, like how to deal with different types of authority, how to ask for another opinion, what rights do you have as a patient, and those are not things that we're very comfortable with discussing, right? So we may turn out to our younger generations to ask for that, to our friends who were born here. So it's the entire component of the understanding. It's that empathy that we need to keep on addressing. But definitely the ICFs must be as simple, ICF stands for informed consent form, sorry. It needs to be as simple as possible. And if you're just looking, I've seen them, and guys, when I signed my mortgage, I had no idea what I was signing in. It's kind of the same thing. And I speak 3 different languages, and I have been in pharma for 20 years. That's not fair for a patient who this is their first experience and has just been informed that has a debilitating disease, a chronic or an acute, probably deadly disease coming up. We need to make things as simple as we can for them. And we also need to educate and help the providers and the HCP to be more inclusive in the way that they behave. To stop thinking and assuming that, oh, this patient, she's not very good at English, she'll probably I won't talk about clinical trials with them. We just need to make sure that we address that provider bias and invite them to offer these opportunities, these treatment opportunities to everyone who is a qualifiable subject. So.
As a follow-up, and I'm sure many here in the audience, because I want to know what role can patients, advocacy groups, and community leaders play in promoting awareness and education among the importance of clinical trial participation among Latinos and other representative groups as a follow-up. And feel free to address.
One thing that we're spending a lot of time thinking about are the concept of clinical trial navigators, patient navigators. Particularly ones that have the cultural alignment that Lorena mentioned with patients that we're looking to target. Outside of the family and outside of the community, these folks are trained in clinical trial navigation, but also have an expertise in the community, and that's one piece that we're really interested in how that works, because the workforce that surrounds these patients is just as important as the patient themselves and their family. So that's one piece I think that comes from a community leadership perspective that could really be something, and that's showing a lot of promise. The promotora model has already been used in some preventive cases, particularly as you come to cardiac disease, obesity, diabetes, things like that. It's already showing promise. Why can't it also show promise for clinical trials as well? Because they're trusted members of the community that are trained to make sure that they're giving the right information to the patients that might be interested.
Yeah, and I think this issue that you bring up of patient advocacy is a core and a critical one to address. And it's also rising in importance. Traditionally, manufacturers thought of themselves as creating the drug, sort of releasing it into the wild, and we'll sort of see what happens in clinical trials as such. But now it's much more of an organic process for how a clinical trial is designed. What are the inclusion and exclusion criteria? How the patient should be treated when they enter into healthcare systems and interact with principal investigators. That process of crafting the clinical trial is now done much more frequently with patient advocacy groups. The NIH, for example, holds workshops where patient advocacy groups contribute to the way the trials themselves will be executed. So that is a significant change in including patients in the process of designing the clinical trials that will ultimately impact their health and well-being.
Yeah, it's with the patient. Oh, sorry.
Go ahead.
I was going to say it should be with the patient, for the patient. Because even in that design, when we look into the schedule of visits, you need to go to the research site every 3 weeks for the next for years, right? But every 3 weeks, you will need to ask for time away from your job. Like, not everyone is covered by health insurance. Someone will need to have someone to cover their shift. Someone will need to take care of their elderly, their children. So make sure that you have that perspective and that point of view in how you design things like that, right? Those schedules. Can you leverage some sort of telemedicine? Can you leverage some sort of hybrid trials in the way that you're designing it? Because it's really important. And also the non-medical staff role has become more and more relevant in building those bonds over and over. Promotoras de salud, the role of the pharmacist. We usually go and we trust the guy that is delivering us our medication on a weekly basis. And the outreach that we need to be building through things as simple as radio, newspapers. Social media, yes, it works, but we also like novelas. I don't know if you're familiar with the program that Dr. Sandoval was mentioning yesterday. So those things there are important for us as a community. And I am really hoping that each of you leave this room and start talking about clinical trials. Like, this is something that Latinos should be aware of, right?
I also would like to add cultural humility and acknowledge the potential in the community. Because I think the community knows how to do their things and how to reach the people and how to bring them. So that means that when you apply for the grant, allocate funds to work with those communities and develop those clinical trials since the beginning with the community. Don't come to the community with an agenda. Come to the community to talk about a possibility of a partnership and how do you see it, and let's start working together. So I think that's powerful, those partnerships and the work of the promotoras, definitely. Those community, if you subcontract the community-based organizations, they will hire the promotoras, they have the trust of the community, and these clinical trials will be very successful, and I have some examples to show you later.
Well, funny, you brought up one aspect of it, but the other aspect is of course, presently, there's substantial financial challenges that act as barriers that have historically limited, increased participation in Latinos in these clinical trials. For instance, as you know, the cost of the clinical trials for companies and medical providers, and the onerous costs on families, such as travel, housing, and time, as indicated earlier. So what initiatives or thoughts have you considered to address these financial inequities to increase participation in these clinical trials?
We're very focused We're very focused on these ancillary costs, right, that are around clinical trials. We have to be very mindful of that. People come from different places. They come from different socioeconomic statuses. Not everybody is coming from low socioeconomic status. We have to make sure that we're catching them if they are. So things like transportation, food, housing, all the things that would be attached to participating in clinical trials definitely need to be covered. And other things that we're thinking about, right, are also outside of that. As you're thinking about caregivers, there's things like childcare. There's things like the last time at work that you mentioned. All of these things we have to be very mindful of, and it's one that we're very concerned about, the ancillary costs, and we make sure that we cover at least the basics from a transportation, housing, food perspective. That's really, really critical.
Yeah, I couldn't agree more. Of course, there's always a balance to strike between overly incentivizing patients to engage in clinical trials and making sure that we are removing the barriers, the financial toxicity, as Claudia mentioned at the beginning. And so striking that balance is very important, but it's almost the heart of an inequity to have populations that for one reason or another, let's say financial, socioeconomic status, are more challenged to engage in a clinical trial and have that become a barrier to engagement. So we find that it's part of our responsibility at Roche and Genentech to make sure that we are supporting patients through this process, as you mentioned, through whether it's transportation or providing meals or making sure that some of those barriers to engage in clinical trials are removed. Because from my perspective, that essentially represents an inequity if certain populations that have the ability to pay can engage in clinical trials and others cannot. So we need to sort of overcome those barriers with these special efforts.
And we need to do that. Yes, right? And we need to do that with the thought of those patients in mind, because when we try to loosen our very, very strict ethics, for example, and release some sort of compensation from patients for their time, their effort, et cetera, like those patients may receive a total amount of dollars that may change their taxable income or their bracket, they may lose some benefits. Is that what we want them to deal with? Can we put that burden in some of the research sites so they help us with food banks, they help us with transportation through the sites? Is there a way for us to ease all these barriers and transform them into drivers for participation? The other important thing is that if we do this as one single company, we need to bring more companies along, so we make sure that there is this trust bond rebuilt in these communities, and it doesn't look like I want you because only you're the one that can help me, but I'm going to offer you this and that. And so we need to ensure that this is an entire benefit, right, for the community, and thought with that population in mind.
Like Lorena just shared, we need to be very creative, finding ways of how to help the community and not create a burden to them. When we talk about the undocumented community that we want to include in clinical trials too, we are talking that if they participate in clinical trials that receive a compensation of more than $600, they will be reported, and that's not beneficial for the legalization process for them. So make sure we understand that, and we don't let them to go over the $600, or maybe combine the use of gift cards maybe to compensate for their time and to make sure they are included in the clinical trials. And remember, always let them know that they never will be reported to the immigration services, because that's not a requirement for academic institutions or for any organizations that is working in the promotion of clinical trials.
Yeah, I just wanted to make one comment. One of our advisors had shared a story, who's a principal investigator, about a patient who was enrolled in a clinical trial and came to the hospital, went into the parking garage, realized how expensive it was to park, and just said, there's no way I can stop here to get my CAT scan to be in this clinical trial, and went home. And so when the patient was reached, the answer that came back from the patient was, it's just too expensive for me to park at your hospital. So sometimes just understanding the challenges that the patients are faced, these are not large ticket items, but they can facilitate the process of entering into clinical trials.
Related to that, right, is the sites that we're working with and the investigators. A lot of sites that see large populations of people of color are also under-resourced. So having sites not have a burden on them as well to manage these financial burdens for their patients is something that we're really focused on as well, because if we're not supporting the investigators and their site staff to see these patients, to not create another burden for them, we don't want to create that knock-on effect where it ends up being that we don't have a represented population. That's something to think about too, from a financial barrier perspective, but also just an administrative burden perspective related to these things.
And there is also, sorry, but there is also where we need, as a community, to make sure that we can reach out for help. We can reach out to different organizations, to advocacy groups, to community outreach. We can reach out to foundations, because the help is out there. But that health literacy, we just finished our first Hispanic Latino patient journey at BMS, and I'm very proud of that, right? But we don't do those things because we do not know that we can. So we need to instill this in the thought process of our community, so they are comfortable enough to ask for help, because we don't ask for help from providers. We don't ask, like, doctor, it's very expensive for me to park there. Can anyone pick me up? Can I park somewhere else? Can I take this CT scan somewhere else? We don't, that's not something that we're comfortable with doing. So much work to do.
No. So all of you on this panel here have talked about the challenges and some of the barriers, but perhaps, for our audience, as they go out from where they come across the United States, can you get some successful initiatives or case studies or some best practices that they can sort of move forward and continue on, given that incorporates all of the remarks that you have had and suggestions? And so what strategies have been employed to kind of achieve these results?
We talked quite a bit about having the concordance factor, right? Having physicians and healthcare providers that match where you come from, or at least understand these communities. So one of the pieces that we're really focused on is what we call workforce development, particularly developing physicians to become clinical trial investigators that represent the communities of the patients that we're trying to reach. So one of the things, and I'm so glad to have Lorena on stage here, is because we've joined the BMS Foundation's Wynn Investigator Training Program or the Robert Wynn Diversity in Clinical Trials Award Program. And what it's doing is training clinical trialists, Hispanic and Latino physicians, Black and African American physicians to become clinical trialists, paired with a mentor over a couple of years, as well as training medical students, because we really need to produce that pipeline of representative physicians that understand not only how to run clinical trials appropriately, but also to engage with their communities in the way that will allow for them to enroll patients like this. So the workforce diversity component for us is critical because we have to produce the physicians that match our communities, or we're not going to get to the place where we want to be.
I would like to share that there are some large-scale research projects like All of Us, and you probably have heard about that. 700,000 people registered, 500,000 people already provide the biological specimen, and 80,000 Latinos has been registered. So that's so far one of the largest studies that is being conducted here in the United States. That means 16% of Latinos being part of it. So what are the key successes of the All of Us? All of Us was designed in Espanol and in English, so that definitely helping to the inclusion of clinical trials. They were using subcontracting with organizations in the community and using promotoras, and the promotoras help educate the community about All of Us. They have a mobile unit that is the Caravan mobile unit that goes all across the United States. I have been with them meeting in Nashville several times, and they go to the community and find the people in the community and establish that trust and that relationship. So that has been one of the successes, but I think the key is to be able to develop the clinical trials and design the clinical trial thinking in those populations that they want to reach. Another success that I would like to share with you that was developed through Vanderbilt and a group of academic institutions across the United States is Research Match. Research Match is a registry where people can register and show the interest of participating in a clinical trial based in their medical conditions. They have to enter information about the medical conditions, and the researchers approach that person through Research Match and said, there is this clinical trial, are you interested to participate? If the person, they say yes, that's fine. If not, they will send another message later. So that Research Match was translated into Espanol, and it was culturally appropriate. Not only translated, because one thing is translated and one other thing is to make it culturally appropriate, into Espanol in 2010, and since then they have been registering at least 15,000 Latinos out of 150,000 in total that they have in that registry. So there are successes, but it took a lot of time. I was part of that process of making that website culturally appropriate and making sure they went through the process of testing the language not only with Mexicanos, but they also did it with Colombianos. They did it also with people from Central America to make sure everybody was understanding what was in the website, and that's part of the culturally appropriate. Hire experts from the community to review whatever you are doing in that specific language.
Mm-hmm. Maybe some examples that I can offer on our end is, yes, the use of promotoras and mobile clinics is very important. Supporting the triage through pharmacists is also something that we have identified as a successful strategy. But another very good thing that we are now implementing is we're helping to train our research sites on inclusive behaviors. We're providing them with curricula on anti-racism resources, unconscious bias, because we give them year over year as sponsors, as big pharmas, we give them year over year a lot of good clinical practices and updates that they need to have as their curricula, but we don't give them these tools. And they need to be aware of, like, well, maybe I have a bias, that's totally normal. If I make it conscious, maybe I can be more fair to the patients that I'm intending to treat. So that is other example that I can speak of. But if I may, I don't know if there is anyone from Moderna in the house. Well, there is also super good example from Moderna when they were enrolling for the COVID trial. at some point they realized that at the beginning of the trial, like halfway to their enrollment, that they were not enrolling enough Black and Hispanic patient participants. And you know what they did? They paused the enrollment and said, how can we reach the communities better? And after, like they said, maybe we will not be the first, but we will be the ones that have the most participation of diverse patients. So those are great examples that take a lot of like leadership endorsement and thought management in making this happen. So I just wanted to point that out as well.
Well, I have a little follow question. Triage, how are you defining triage with the pharmacist? Because
When I am impressed, but if, just to give you an example, my child takes a specific medication, and I receive at my home constant information about clinical trials from the pharmacy. I receive the medication for my son. I am in like, algorithms do work. More than Netflix, algorithms work and everything, right? So and when you go and ask your pharmacist, like, is there any specific adverse event for this? They will tell you, you need to check with your physician, right? But all like Walgreens and CVS, you know, they have like this very big focus on health equity as well, just to mention some, right? And the amount of data that they are managing is huge. And the amount of connections that they are creating with big sponsors and pharmas and biotechs is huge. It's not that a pharmacist will tell you, why don't you try a clinical trial?
Yeah.
Let's hope not, right? But asking those questions is good. And the other thing, we're providing materials, like you were talking about being cultural appropriate. We all have resources online. You know, when COVID was at its highest, like, Mom, where did you find that information? Facebook, mija, Facebook. But we need to make sure that they are aware of clinicaltrials.gov, that they know about Study Connect, that they know about My Trials. Like, all pharmas have this information, and all of us have them available in Spanish. Maybe a broken Spanish, right? But they are available in Spanish, so just to have them there.
this is, I'm sorry, go ahead, Dr.
Just
Reed.
very briefly, I think there are two success factors I might want to draw attention to. One is internal to our organization, Gentech, and one is external, sort of a regulatory environment. From an internal perspective, we are building in nurse navigators as part of the process of engaging in clinical trials. We often talk about the challenge of clinical trial enrollment of diverse populations, but it's kind of like getting accepted to college. That's just step one. It's getting through the trial. It also matters. So it's incorporating nurse navigators into the process, so we're following up with at-risk patients to be non-adherent or to drop out of clinical trials. So to recognize that patients can come in the front door but not complete the clinical trial. So that's one specific effort. And from an external perspective, we'd be remiss if we didn't address the fact that the Food and Drug agencies in the United States have changed their perspective on diversity in clinical trial dramatically in the last 2 years. And we've gone from just mere guidance documents and suggestions, and you ought to do this, to being included directly in the 2023 Omnibus law. So there's an act inside called the DEPICT Act, which essentially mandates that manufacturers have diversity action plans, that we have in place effectively a promise to federal regulators that we will be more inclusive with respect to our clinical trials. So make no mistake about it. It is indeed an ethical imperative, but it also is demanded by a regulatory environment as well that is changing actively.
You know, I'm a member of the coalition for the Rare Disease Diversity Coalition, and there are many of these conversations is about what can we do in terms of legislation, regulatory fixes. And as you start out, Dr. Pierre, can you elaborate, and all of you can, if possible, collaborate on some of the proposed fixes and the potential impact on increasing Latino representation in clinical trials, as well as other ideas that perhaps from your perspective you were having conversation with your peers about how to move some of these forwards to sort of advocate for your companies as well as the representative patients and our individuals here?
I like that you bring up your experience in rare disease, because we've been having this conversation at Amgen about rare disease, right? The way that you approach rare disease patients, you put a ton of money, a ton of resources, a ton of attention just to get 1 or 2 patients. And the way that we're approaching reaching represented populations is very similar to that, because we feel like we have so much ground to make up for, that approaching it like a rare disease patient is really the right way to go, right? Putting the resources behind it, the strategy, a fully dedicated team, to put towards even just one patient, that makes it better than what we had in the past. So that's important to bring up kind of the concept behind rare disease and how that works. Regarding diversity action plans, I think that's the top of mind for all of our companies, honestly. But I think all of us on the stage actually started work towards developing these even before it was a guidance, before it was something that was included in a law, because we saw it was important. And those diversity action plans include things like making sure that our populations match what the epi data looks like, and that's the incidence and prevalence of disease, and making sure that our operational plans are specifically aligned to the communities we're trying to reach. And that can mean anything from what we've talked about today, from language to where we run clinical trials to the kinds of investigators that we're recruiting. So we've been working on this for several years, but as you mentioned, with some of those guidelines, it's really put the fire on us internally, but also makes us share more of our best practices across companies.
Yeah. I think that as sponsors, we're very happy, and we are applauding that the agency brought them as an official request, right? Because that gave our voice a little bit more of power. And now the clinical studies and the study teams are listening to what we have been saying for so long, right? Because they need to be submitting this as part of the briefing document. And then when we propose that and when we meet with those subject matter experts that look into the safety, the efficacy, how it reflects with the epidemiology, and we commit to a specific goal of representation, we need the study teams to fund, those strategies, because when it comes to clinical trials, it's always how much it's gonna cost me, how fast am I gonna get the approval, and how many patients I'm enrolling. Guess what? We need to have the right patient from the very beginning. So if we do that while we are designing this from the design instead of an afterthought, we might be providing better opportunities for patients. So the study diversity plans are great. I'm also happy to see that they are trying to look more into diversity from different perspectives, not only race and ethnicity, because let's talk about sexual and gender minorities, let's talk about people with disabilities, and Latinos and the intersectionality that we bring, and Blacks and the intersectionality that we bring is so huge that we need to better understand that. However, there are some challenges, like in the way that we collect the data, because there are Latinos all around the world, But here in the US, less and less Latinos are self-identifying themselves as Latinos at some point, especially when it comes to the medical setting. So how can we address that? And things are as interesting, like half of our patients in Latin America, they do not identify as Latinos. So how can we evolve the way that we categorize our data? So we collect the right data and we analyze the right data. So there's the very, very good thing about this, but there's also the challenges. Well, also the agency is aware of that, and the OMB also is proposing a new description of those categories.
Yeah, I just think, just to build on that, because that's such an important point about this, I think it's a misnomer that expanding and diversifying clinical trials has to translate into slowing down the process or impairing clinical research, which I actually take as I almost find that insulting. I feel like you're expanding the populations that we eventually plan to market to. It is part of the process of clinical research, and it's important for us to make that argument to our clinical teams that not only is this incumbent upon us to address all populations, but also that it will not slow down the clinical development process in making sure that we address traditionally underserved populations.
In fact, it could be faster. If we're doing this properly, you could actually get to your timelines faster, and that's kind of the argument we're making internally as well.
That's right.
What specific recommendations can you have for healthcare providers, research, and policymakers? I'm sure we have some congressional staffers here that help them to engage and collaborate with Latino communities to promote clinical trials and inclusion effectively.
I believe that designing clinical trials where you allocate money to subcontract community-based organizations and work with them is a very good advice and a very successful way to advance in inclusion of Latinos and African Americans. Work with the communities, go, be present, engage.
I think that I'm always ending some of these sessions with this concept, and you brought up cultural humility, right? Whether you're a sponsor company, whether you're a legislator, whether you're a physician, approaching with a lens of humility is the most important. It's admitting that you might not know everything. It's admitting that you're a partner with your patients and their communities. So regardless of what technical things we're talking about out here, laws or clinical trials, if you're always approaching with humility, you'll get to the right place. And I think that's the best way to talk about advocating not only for patients in the Hispanic Latino community, but also for yourselves as physicians and community members. That level of humility is critical.
As the evolving after the sort of during the pandemic and afterwards, there's been kind of an evolving and shifting landscape for healthcare and research, and so there's a lot of shifts in technology and telemedicine, and so what has in your engagement with many of your partners, has it caused you to kind of sort of leverage it to improve access and participation in these clinical trials for Latinos, and particularly historical excluded groups, particularly how there's still a broadband and digital divide? And so as a lot have been thought now, and now we're living finally in a post-pandemic world.
So maybe for those of you who were yesterday in Dr. Fabian's, it wasn't Dr. Fabian's, but in the other breakout, he mentioned how there is this challenge. Well, it was mentioned, the digital divide, and how this may impact the fact that not everyone knows how to use a mobile phone. Not everyone knows how to scan a QR code. Not everyone knows what is a two-way identification. So you need to be sure that if you're offering that, you're also helping the patient or the caregiver to understand how it works and how it can benefit you. That's the very important role of the non-medical staff that we have identified, as well as community outreach organization and some advocacy groups that have helped us on that. Because yes, it is this dichotomy of it may be easier for those who know how to use it or have access. There are so many households in this place that in this country that can only have that may not have access to internet, or that may only have one plug to connect your electronic devices. So we also need to understand that while we provide them with the tools in order to make this happen.
I just heard in the previous breakout that there is going to be an allocation of $4.9 million to increase broadband in the communities in the United States, which is wonderful, because that's one of the reasons many people cannot participate in clinical trials. But we have to keep in mind that not only broadband is the issue. There is a lot of people that choose not to have broadband access into their house, and they still relied on the letters, receive the letters in the mail, and the person that approached them in the community. So we have to find different approaches to continue advancing in this issue.
Yeah, I love the way you put that, Claudia, because it's almost, the way I look at clinical research, it's highly technical on the back end, but it's actually high touch on the customer end, on the front end, if you will. So, so we put a lot of energy and resources into artificial intelligence and assessing large databases as to where our clinical trial site should go and all of this work. But at the end of the day, it is a clinician, it is a nurse, it is a navigator, it is a conversation with a family. So we think it's incumbent upon us to do the work on the back end from a technical standpoint and use all of the tools at our disposal, but that should translate into a culturally humble and appropriate conversation at the point of care. So we use the technical tools to enable the direct patient to clinician interaction.
Yeah. We need to think about the people that cannot read, cannot write, cannot have access to the technology, so we have to approach them.
And that's where your point, Claudia, about involving the community right at the beginning is important. My current dissertation research right now is studying this actual topic, and I would say from patients and providers specifically, the concept of technology and its usage should be introduced and evaluated by communities themselves as early as possible, the technology itself, but also the way it will be used. And that way you can use the technology with all the power it has, but not create that digital divide that Lorena mentioned, because technology isn't the answer to everything, but it can be if it's developed in a partnership.
Well, I see we have questions in here, and if you could, we're going to open up the microphone for Q&A. But if you can say, give your name and where you're from, or part of the country, whatever.
Sure. Hello, everyone. Buenos días. Mi nombre es Ignacio Álvarez. Soy de San Juan, Puerto Rico. Un placer. I'll continue in English. So I work for the National Kidney Foundation. Being born and raised in Puerto Rico, it's sort of an opportune moment to work at NKF, given the burden that kidney disease has in Puerto Rico and broadly in the U.S., and not just Hispanics, but African Americans as well, disproportionately across the board. In the continuum of kidney health, whether it's those that are at risk, pre-diabetics, diabetics, or hypertensive, to stage 1 through 5 CKD, end-stage renal disease, or organ transplant, from access to care from the continuum of kidney health to care coordination. I mean, the disparity is real, and it's something that in clinical research, I've seen that it's shown in our endeavor to engage with the United States Preventive Services Task Force that provides screening recommendation at the primary care level. There is no CKD screening as of right now, citing the need for more research. But the research is there, and standing in front of all of you and hearing the input that you've given all of us, I want to speak a little bit more concretely into a specific issue, which is kidney disease on Hispanics, on African Americans. Have you seen anything on clinical research? I mean, I have provided everything from KDOQI guidelines to ADA, AHA. I've even portrayed that it's not just about kidney health, it's avoiding cardiovascular disease, because once you have renal failure, you are at the highest risk of developing cardiovascular disease, which is the highest mortality rate or cause of mortality in the US, or one of the highest, excuse me. I'm not a clinician or researcher, so please correct me in my mistakes. Como soy puertorriqueño, soy bien apasionado para muchas de estas cosas. Yo no les puedo decir, trabajando en el hospital, cómo fue llevar paciente al único centro de diálisis en Puerto Rico a los 15 años como un patient transporter. Ver gente give up on their lives, when you're 15, taking them to dialysis center, the only dialysis center in Puerto Rico. I mean, it gives you perspective. And I grew up privileged in Puerto Rico, and I'm trying to use that to break privilege in general. So I'm asking you, if now or moving forward, please engage with NKF. We're trying to engage with USPSTF using already existing clinical practice guidelines and clinical trials that I am under the impression that have already been done to engage in the screening recommendation. So I know it's not an ask per se. I just wanted to let you know that everything you've shared is worthwhile.
You make a really great point, and I just wanted to jump in, if I may,
Yep.
is because there's something you said that's actually critical to the work we do in clinical trials. Are the inclusion and exclusion criteria often have kidney indicators as one of the reasons why we include or exclude patients from clinical trials, and that can often disproportionately impact traditionally underserved populations. So we would love to work with your organization to better understand some of your capacities to help us reconfigure our inclusion and exclusion criteria for clinical trials, which clearly disproportionately impacts patients of color, and we'd love to talk with you more about that.
No, of course, certainly, and thank you for your input and your time.
And thank you for what you're doing.
Of course, no,
Thank you.
gracias a
Thank you,
ustedes.
yes.
Next. Oh, she.
Hello, my name is Andrew. I'm with Amgen. I'm kind of really inspired hearing all the work with pharmacists and nurse navigators, because I'm a pharmacist by training, and there are so many areas here in America and even outside where there are no physicians there. So looking at the workforce development, I think that's really wonderful. One topic that I'm really interested in is the trustworthiness of institutions. Over the past 5 years, you are the experts. Have you seen, I think of trustworthiness as a continuum, right? So over the past 5 years, have you seen any improvement with that trustworthiness? And what has been what has impacted that over that time period? Another question I had was, Gustavo mentioned in the beginning that it's only about 6% of clinical trial populations are Latinos. I think this is very similar in the same with other underserved populations. But my question would be, what is good practice in terms of increasing diversity in clinical trials? What percentage will make sense for us? And how do you categorize or quantify that? Is that based on populations? How do we think through that in terms of setting goals and see where we have come from maybe 5-10 years from now?
Thank you. Thank you for your question. So if you allow me, two things that are important. We haven't measured the evolution, right? At least we were able to establish a baseline, and that's the work that we did at Bristol Myers Squibb. We measured the impact of that concordance factor. However, we do have a challenge as we only allow patients to self-identify their race and ethnicity. We're not allowing HCPs or principal investigator or pharmacists to self-identify. We are offering them the ways to do that, like through different portals like SIP and things that may not be their preferred tool, right? But that is not a general practice. So one of the things that we're pursuing is that we allow providers to self-identify their demographics, their race, their ethnicity, their sexual orientation, gender identity, and others, so we can have more clarity of what is that match with patients. But we're trying to do it with many other pharmas on board. And I think that, to your point, we need to understand, like 5 years from now, if there has been an increase or not, because our last reading has only, like, it's from the past 5 years, but definitely interested in see how it looks like. However, qualitatively, sorry, I can see that there are more attitudes towards trusting. In our patient journey, we saw that Latino patients, they have blind trust in their healthcare providers. So we need to continue working on that.
I think if we want to advance in precision medicine, we definitely have to make several changes and more inclusion and make sure people is self-identified to really know the trace of the diseases. So something that Vanderbilt University Medical Center did this past weekend, I heard the announcement, was to increase the demographic self-identified capturing data from patients, so that way people has the opportunity to say where they are coming from. So when I came to United States 30 years ago, I didn't know I was part of the bucket of Latinos. I was Colombian, I'm still Colombian. So, but I never had the opportunity to self-identify as Colombian. So now we are having that opportunity in all the data that is going to be captured at the Vanderbilt University Medical Center for the LGBTQ community with people with special needs. So several questions that allowed me to feel myself and for them to be able to study the genetics of the diseases that we are treating.
Well, regrettably, we've come to the end of the session, but I know we had some individuals out here who have some Q&A, and if I'm sure you're welcome to take some conversations off stage, but I want each of you to have an opportunity to have closing remarks about your participation in this panel, but I also like to think that how do you envision success for this next short term, next 3 years as part of your closing comments?
So I personally am hoping that my role is no longer needed at some point. I still want to go to work, right? But there shouldn't be a need for a head of diversity strategy in R&D. So clinical trials are thought with the right population from the very beginning, and we recruit the right patients as we move forward. We think about those who need our medicines the most. So that's how I think about it.
Yeah, I would build on that. I couldn't agree more. It's just to say that just as you would never think about developing a drug without attention to the safety and the efficacy of the drug, so too should an inclusive strategy be very much part of any clinical development program. So I don't really even see this as being a specific effort. It's part and parcel of what it means to do drug discovery and drug development. So this is an evolution, and I think we're moving in the right direction, but it's integrated in the way we do business.
I think the vision for us, right, is that our clinical trial populations match the real world, right? That's the goal. So when that becomes part of our DNA, like my colleagues have been describing, then, right, we don't have jobs in this roles anymore, but that's the goal, honestly. That's what we're trying to get to. So as we're developing those things, we work cross-industry, we're not competitive. You can see us all up here together. That's the vision of that we're working together to get to that place, and that we're in a place where we're no longer talking about this as a special session separate from here, but it's just part of what we do.
I think my goal in 5 years is to see that we are designing clinical trials that include everybody, and to see more collaboration between the academic institutions, the pharma, the community organizations, to see that synergy moving towards the goal of increase more participation of Latinos, because we need to have medicines and treatments that work for us too.
Well, as I move forward, I hope these conversations we had is moving one step forward so we can really get increased participation and diversity. But I want to thank our, great panelists, Claudia Barajas, Raquel Ricadio, Dr. Pierre Theodore, and Lorena Curry. And so thank you all. Don't forget to keep tweeting hashtag CHCIHMM23. And, we have our luncheon preliminary. I'm running out of little voice here. But thank you once again, and thank you all.
Thank you.
Thank you.